Museum. He's going to talk to you a little bit about the books, about the exhibition. Rob Renning is going to talk to us about his experiences of visiting the workshops when they were operational, and then Simon Fowler is going to talk to us about Rob the man. Just to sort of set up what we're doing here, about 10 years ago, Tom came to me and said, have you ever thought about doing an exhibition on the Rob Walker racing team? And I said, you what? No, never heard of him. Never heard of him. It's true, isn't it, Tom? True. Absolutely true. So Tom told me all about it. I thought, that's crazy. That's a story that really needs to be told. So everything went from there, the books, the exhibition, and then the parade in 2018 in the town. And this is the culmination, really, of it, that we're finally going to get a blue plaque for future generations, you know, going past to say, okay, I've never heard of Rob. Who is he? They can then go and Google him and find out about Rob. So it's a permanent memorial in the town here. So it's just fantastic. And we have to thank for that the Dorking Society are our trustees. They've been responsible for putting up blue plaques in Dorking for about the last 50 years. Until recently they hadn't done one for about 30 years, so we said, you know, we need to update this. We need, because people who are within living memory now are slipping into history. So we did a couple in 2018 and we're very pleased to be able to do this one now. So I'd like to thank the Dorking Society, and particularly the chairman, Jean Ward, for supporting this initiative. And also to the family of Brian Carr. Brian Carr is a previous chairman of the Dorking Society, and he left a little legacy, and we said, well, can we use that legacy for the blue plaque scheme? So the plaque is going to be part funded by that legacy there. Anyway, that's enough for me. I'm going to hand you on to Tom.
Hello everybody. Yay. And thank you for all coming today, and what a lovely day it is. In fact, every one of the Rob Walker events has been blessed with what I call Walker weather. It was back in the early 2000s that I first discovered a Formula One racing team once operated from a base here in Dorking. I've always been interested in motor racing and have been living in Dorking since 1986, but I had no idea the Walker team was based in the town. I felt that Rob and his team's remarkable story needed to be told to a wider audience. So in 2015 I approached Cathy Atherton at Dorking Museum with the idea of an exhibition about his racing team. The rest, as they say, is history. Since then we've had the exhibition, 2 talks, 2 books, the Dorking Town Partnership's parade of cars around the town, and now this soon to be unveiled blue plaque have followed. None of these events would have happened without the help and encouragement of some marvellous people who give so much time and energy to the Dorking Museum. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the wonderful people connected to the Rob Walker racing team that I've met over the past few years. Thank you and enjoy your afternoon.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon again, and very welcome to you all. Fantastic crowd here to celebrate this important occasion. Fortunately, I'm blessed with a good memory. A good memory that I'm happy to share with you today about the Rob Walker team, the most successful private entrant in Grand Prix motor racing history. Let's wind the clock back to the 8th of January 1958, when I was a mere lad of 15. I had the great privilege to visit the workshops, which are down yonder, or were down yonder at the end of Tuts Close, about 50 yards down. There was Tuts Motor Body Workshop, where this little black building is, and beyond it was the Elim Church Hall, which Rob Walker bought back in the late 50s. and used as his racing workshop. My visit was on a wet, claggy midwinter morning, but inside the works everything changed. It was a magical experience. For there was the little Cooper T43 being prepared by Alf Francis for the Argentine Grand Prix just 11 days later. The story got better because just after the 11-day period the car was air freighted out to Argentine, and Sterling Moss turned the Grand Prix world on its head and won the race using all his skill and tactics. The achievement stunned the world. The team's first Formula One win, the first win by a Cooper Formula One car, and the first by a private entrant. An unheard of achievement. And all with a team of just 6 personnel. You compare that with this age today, it's beyond comparison. So I've got a short story for you. I love short stories that end with a smile. Once the race cars were prepared and completed, they then needed to be tested. And the team's solution to this challenge was for Alf Francis to drive the Cooper or the Lotus down the A24 at around 6 a.m. in the morning with a fire extinguisher jammed between his legs. Must have been very uncomfortable. He'd go down to the Gibbons Grove roundabout, do a turn round the roundabout itself and come back on the other lane. The problem was that the good folk who lived in Mickleham didn't appreciate being woken up at that unearthly hour in the morning by an unsilenced Coventry Climax racing engine, blasting by at least 80 miles an hour, and they'd phone the police, who I don't think are here today, so I'm free to speak. They'd phone the police and the police would come round, and they would make inquiries, by which time the car was back in the workshop, covered up, and the team would deny any responsibility for having any misdemeanour at all. And apparently no tickets or charges were ever dished out. Of course, it's quite unthinkable to think that that might have happened today. It just wouldn't happen. But it happened in the day. And talking to a colleague here, a friend, a local man who I don't know his name, he's probably here now, this circumstance went on through to the mid-1960s. And then there was a little incident, and one of the cars ran off the A24 somewhere and caused a bit of a stir. No one was hurt, but it brought an end an interesting testing situation. And of course, and I'm very grateful to Tom for this, we're not only celebrating today with a blue plaque, but we also have another anniversary to celebrate. On the 23rd of August 1959, the RRC Walker Racing Team won the Portuguese Grand Prix, with Sterling Moss winning the team's 3rd Grand Prix in a Cooper T51. And the team's other driver, Maurice Trintignant, scored more points by coming home 4th in another Cooper. That was 64 years ago. I cannot overlook our appreciation of the two owners of former racing cars that are here today. I'd like to thank Richard Parnell for bringing his Formula One Walker Climax, a unique car built in great secrecy in 1960, with parts being manufactured in small workshops around Dorking, brought together and assembled in the workshops down yonder. Thank you, Richard, especially as you're off to Silverstone to race this weekend. I wish you well. We had fun offloading this car this morning onto London Road. All other motorists were very respectful of the situation, and we hope they will be when we load it up later. And our thanks must go to Clive Beecham, owner of the very special Ferrari 250 GT SWB, registration 1SWB. This is the car Rob Walker bought for Moss to race in 1961. Entered for 7 races and won 6. 7th he retired. His most famous victory was winning the Tourist Trophy 3-hour GT race at Goodwood. 108 laps in a time of 3 hours, 1 minute and 12 seconds at an average speed of something over 86 miles an hour. It was Moss's 7th and last victory in that prestigious race. We're really very grateful to Tom Ransom for bringing the car down today, driven on the road, as all good GT cars should be. I'm sure lots of heads were turned as he went by. As long as they kept their eye on the road, all would have been well. So thank you, Tom. Massive privilege to have the car here, and for you here to be here to share it with us. The most valuable short wheelbase 250 GT in the world, and there were about 150 odd made. So it's an extremely precious metal car. Thank you. So now I think it's a great pleasure of welcoming Simon Taylor to join us, who knew Rob Walker personally well, and he's going to give us some of his memories.
I'm not sure if I need this modern technology because people tell me I have a loud voice, but if any of you can't hear, you can't hear? I don't think is this working? No. I don't think so. Well, let me forget about that and I will shout. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, the real problem I've got is knowing when to stop, because I could talk all day and all night about Rob Walker and what he achieved, but also what a wonderful and delightful man he was. The first thing to say is that some of you, not me, may spend your Sunday afternoons welded to your sofa watching a sort of television show which pretends to be Formula One. It isn't, as far as I'm concerned, Formula One. It's a sort of overpaid, overhyped television show. We've got in this country Strictly Come Dancing, we've got Love Island, and we've got Formula One. And as far as I'm concerned, they should all go in the same box. Now that sounds extremely prejudiced, but I'm lucky enough to have watched Grand Prix racing in the 1950s, the 1960s, by which time I was doing it professionally, not the racing, but the writing and talking about it. And the fact that Rob Walker ran his little team from the bottom of this alley, and it was a cinder track in those days, it wasn't so beautifully polished as it is now. And the fact with 5 people he was able to run a racing team. There were lots of privateer racing teams in those days, but they didn't win races. They made up the grid. Rob Walker's team was different. And part of why it was different was that he was such a delightful man that he was able to persuade, in the days when persuasion didn't come in millions of pounds, persuasion came in sportsmanship and running a team that was friendly. He was then able to persuade some of the best drivers in the world to drive for him. The reason why he ran a racing team, he had initially wanted to be a racing driver himself. And actually, as a young man at Cambridge, as an undergraduate, he was already racing, and in fact, amazingly, did Le Mans, the last Le Mans 24 hours before World War II. He did it in his own car, a De La Haye, which was a little bit like being an undergraduate, being a student and having the latest McLaren. It was not something that every student had, but Rob did. He had this De La Haye, and he got the help of a top professional driver, because you need, of course, 2 drivers at Le Mans. He got a top professional driver to help him, a chap called Ian Connell, who was a very good driver. And obviously Ian Connell started the race, and they carried on through the race against the top works teams. But unfortunately, Ian Connell, when he was getting out of the car after a pit stop, put his arm against the hot exhaust pipe that went past the cockpit and burnt himself so badly that he wasn't able to carry on in the race. And so Rob, from about 7 o'clock, I mean, Robbie will be able to tell me whether I've got the detail of this right, but my understanding is from about 7 o'clock in the evening, on the Saturday evening, through to 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon when the race finished, Rob did the entire race on his own. And one unscheduled pit stop was that Rob was driving wearing the sort of appropriate tweed suit that a gentleman wears during the afternoon, but you don't really wear a tweed suit after dark. So he came in and made a pit stop and changed into a darker suit to do the racing in the evening hours. All the Works de la Haye stopped. The Works de la Haye pit was in the next door pit, and Monsieur, he wasn't called Monsieur de la Haye, but he was this grand Frenchman who ran the de la Haye team, and he was so ecstatic that all his cars had retired, but this one young Englishman had managed to get his car up into 7th place, that he insisted that he was called in, got out a bottle of champagne and toasted him, and Rob quaffed quite a lot of the champagne, which means by the time he got back into the race, he was in 8th position. But fortunately, he was able to fight his way back to 7th. Now, he had, like the sort of brave man that he was, he had a very brave war. And after the war, of course, he wanted to come back into racing, but his wife, his new wife, Betty, said, "I'm not going to be married to somebody who risks his neck every Sunday afternoon." And of course, in those days, racing drivers did die a lot. So Rob said, well, if I can't race, I want to stay near motor racing. I will run my own team. And he started I am going to go on too long, so wave at me if I've gone on for too long, but one further discussion about the de la Haye. He still had the de la Haye, and he had a rather splendid, rather wild chap called Guy Gale, who was his co-driver, and Guy Gale took the de la Haye off to Holland to do a race at Zandvoort. And when the car returned to Dover, the police descended on it and found the fuel tank had a false compartment inside it which was full of very expensive Swiss watches. So they impounded the car. Of course, Rob knew absolutely nothing about this, but they did get the car back in the end, but I think it cost Rob quite a lot. Well, Rob's racing team, while it remained extremely small, became better and better, and he was winning races. He established his wonderful colours. Rob, of course, was a Scotsman. The Scottish racing colours, unofficially, are dark blue, and he had the idea of having a white band round the nose, as you see with this unique Walker Climax. And also, if you look at the Ferrari there, you'll see once again Rob's distinctive colours of blue with a white band round the nose. And I said earlier that Rob got great drivers to drive for him because he was such a wonderful chap. In fact, it's nice to remember that Rob's passport, you had to say in those days what your profession was. What was Rob going to put as his profession? He put gentleman. And that was not boastful in any way, it was merely accurate. Rob Walker was a gentleman. And he got Sterling Moss to drive for him, and that started a quite extraordinary relationship between the two men. You've got to remember that Sterling Moss was, by any measure, the best racing driver in the world. As soon as Fangio had died, Moss was the man, not only in Grand Prix racing, but in sports car racing. He'd race anything. I do remember on one occasion Sterling raced a lawnmower, although it wasn't painted blue on that occasion. And this great relationship worked between Rob and Sterling, so much that after Sterling had won countless races, and we heard from Rob earlier about that wonderful victory in Argentina, history-making victory, and there were many, many more wins. And when he got to 1962, the best driver in the world was still driving for this little private team that was produced from a cul-de-sac in Dorking. And of course everybody wanted Sterling Moss, and in the end he had lots of offers. He always said, I want to go on driving for Rob Walker. You can pay me much more money, but I want to go on driving for Rob Walker. And finally Enzo Ferrari said to him, you have got to drive for me. And Sterling said, the only condition under which I will race for Ferrari is if you paint the car blue with a white band around the nose. This is a red Ferrari. And amazing. And then he said, I want the car to be delivered to Dorking, and I want Rob's chaps to look after it. And it's an indication of how much respect Enzo Ferrari had for Sterling and for Rob Walker. Incredible, because he was a bloody old man, Enzo Ferrari. He was a difficult fellow, but he agreed. And so Sharknose Grand Prix car, Sharknose Ferrari, was to be delivered here, painted blue, and run by Rob Walker for Sterling Moss. Sadly, it never happened because on Easter Monday 1962, Sterling had the dreadful accident at Goodwood, which ended his professional career. Rob continued, and there were other wonderful people who drove for Rob and were looked after by Rob in this extraordinary way. I'll only mention one, which was Joe Siffert, who was a great Swiss driver. He and Rob had that same sort of close relationship, and there was a wonderful victory. You could say the only privateer victory that's taken place in, call it, modern Formula One, which was at the British Grand Prix in 1968. By then Rob was running a Lotus. Joe Siffert was driving it. He won the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. Extraordinary victory. I think it was 3 years later, by which time Joe Siffert was driving for BRM, and I was at Brands Hatch during a non-championship Formula One race they had in October at the end of the season, and there was an accident out at the back of the circuit. I was a working journalist. I had to find out what was happening, and I rushed down the pit lane, and I saw Rob walking towards me with tears pouring down his face, and I realised that those tears had to be for Joe Siffert, and Joe had actually died in the accident. And that gives a tiny indication of how Rob was not the hard-nosed win or bust Formula One driver, a Formula One team manager. He was the man who really had a close working relationship with his drivers, and that Sterling Moss relationship was so much a part of his life. I'll only mention one more bit. Well, as I say, I could talk all night about Rob, such a wonderful man. But when he stopped racing, because finally Formula One was getting too commercial, it didn't really fit in with Rob and how he wanted to go motor racing. He said he wasn't really having fun anymore. So he stopped. The team was disbanded, but he couldn't leave Formula One alone. So, of all things, he became a journalist. And he became a man who went to all the Grand Prix and wrote reports about Grand Prix racing. Now, Rob was a man who didn't rush. He had this wonderful, slow, deep, deliberate way of speaking. His handwriting was immaculate, but it wasn't joined up. Each letter was separate. And he didn't really look like somebody who was going to be a successful journalist. Well, fortunately, he did a deal with an American magazine, Road and Track, which had very long deadlines. So he was able to write for them by hand, and I don't know, he probably posted his reports to them. And of course they were wonderful because he wrote extremely well. He wrote as he spoke, with humour, and a man who loved to tell a tale. I was privileged to be one of the little group of Formula One journalists who went to races each each Grand Prix. Every fortnight we'd be in Japan, or we'd be in Watkins Glen, or we'd be in Brazil. It was a wonderful, wonderful life. And Rob was always there, and we would sit and have dinner with him. And of course the stories kept coming. He had the most extraordinary sense of humour. He was a quite extraordinary man. I loved him dearly. And therefore, how wonderful that he is being recognised here, where that extraordinary enterprise carried on at the end of a grubby cinder track with just a handful of rather grubby but very talented mechanics, and the blue plaque will always remind us of that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that. Can we now hand over to Robbie Walker, Rob's son, to unveil the plaque?
I'm not going to speak for very long, because if I spoke as slowly as my father, you'd still be here at 3 o'clock. But anyway, it's lovely to see you all here, and such a treat to see the cars as well, which was totally unexpected. I always used to walk down the streets of London and I'd spot these blue plaques, and I thought how lovely it would be to have one for my father. And I never did anything about it. And you can imagine my astonishment and joy when Dorking Society contacted me the other day and said that they had one and would I unveil it. And I regard it as a huge honor. I can't think of a better location than here for it to be placed, frankly, and much better than London. I know a lot of work went into actually arranging this. It's not something you can click your fingers and happen overnight. And I'd very much like to thank Kathy from the museum and Rob and Tom Loftus from the Brooklyn Society who arranged this, and a lot of others, I'm sure, behind the scenes. My father loved coming here, not just because it was the hub of his motor racing centre, but he really enjoyed the town and meeting a lot of the local inhabitants. As a family, we are so proud of him, and it's so lovely to see that you are here today. He would have been just, I think, speechless to find this plaque had been made, and it was just a terribly moving gesture, I think, to do it, and I thank you all for that. You've heard a lot of stories, but I'll just tell you a quick one about a 1927 Delage that used to reside in the racing shop down there. And this car had the most evocative, if not ear-splitting, exhaust note you could ever imagine. And occasionally my father would start it up for friends. And before he did so, he would always check his watch. And he'd always turn it off after 90 seconds running, because he knew that either the aforementioned local constabulary or the long-suffering inhabitants around about would be making their complaints. I'm sure Tony Cleverly would have many more stories, and I apologise on behalf of anybody who still remembers these incidents. There's nothing else for me to say. I don't know the protocol, of unveiling a plaque. But anyway, it gives me a lot of pleasure to do so now.